Welcome to Chapter 12. We're talking in this chapter about the Industrial Revolution and the way it transformed society. Here we have a brief chronology of some important events that happened during the Industrial Revolution. One of those was Hargreaves' spinning jenny, and we'll talk a little about that in this chapter. Also, the modern steam engine was developed in this period, and the first railway line is built in England. So we have a lot to cover and to look at in forms of transformations during the Industrial Revolution. The cotton industry was actually one of the first to be mechanized. In the cottage industries, the whole family would contribute in order to make thread and cloth, that sort of thing. So the spinning jenny, created by James Hargreaves, actually came as this aha moment as he's watching his family make cloth. He thought, what if we could do this on a bigger scale? And that invention really changed the textile industry. Much like Smitty, Werber, Jaegerman, Jensen, and SpongeBob, Britain was number one. There were several advantages that gave Britain the lead in industrialization. First of all, they had been working with metal and mining for a long time. They had a long tradition of it. They also had large supplies of coal and iron. They had river transportation that was supplemented by canals and turnpikes. They also had a sizable labor pool of workers that had been displaced from farms by enclosure movement. They had available investment capital. They had markets at home plus overseas for emerging industries. The colonies would provide raw materials, and they also had a vigorous spirit of enterprise, individualism, and placed a high value on the control of nature. So at this point in time, remember, we still have colonies in the United States, or what will become the United States. So it was very important that Britain have these colonies to provide raw materials to them. So not only do they have the raw materials that are available to them in their country, but they will get things shipped to them by the colonist. This whole idea is going to propel the trade agreements that Britain develops and the system that they work out with the colonies, which will eventually lead the colonists to revolution later on. Harvesting grain with a horse-drawn machine released great numbers of laborers from farms to work in factories or cities. The great demand for labor may explain in part the constant search for and investment in mechanical devices for farm and factory in the United States, a major food exporter even today. And the way this works is that the horses would pull this apparatus, and those things that you see are blades, and so one blade goes through and cuts the grain, the other blades systematically sweep through and push it aside. So not only is it making cutting easier, it's also making the pickup easier by putting it in piles. As I've already mentioned, the cotton industry was one of the first to be mechanized. And the reason for that, the reason that there's so much industrialization of this industry, is that the more cloth that could be produced, there was more demand for it. So supply and demand, right? British cotton production expanded tenfold from 1760 to 1785, and then again another tenfold from 1785 to 1825. There were several inventions along the way. The flying shuttle was invented by John Kay, and it let weavers double their output. That was an invention from 1733. Hargreaves' spinning jenny from 1768 allowed the operator to spin on several spindles at once, which really sped up production. There was a water frame invented by Richard Arkwright in 1773 that was also a spinning machine. Now, it's called a water frame, but it could actually also be powered by animal power. So if you were not close to a water source, that's okay. You could have it powered by animal power. The spinning mule by Samuel Crompton in 1779 allowed many spindles to be powered simultaneously, which, as you can imagine, really increased output. 1785's power loom was created by Edmund Cartwright, and this all became so much more efficient at this point to bring workers together instead of the putting out system. So we start having kind of a workplace where people actually go together in order to work for this cotton production, this textile production, which was different from the putting out system. If you'll remember from previous discussions, the putting out system is where, say, one family might create thread, another family might then create cloth from that thread, yet another family might dye that fabric that's resulting. So this way you have a lot of people still working together, but working together to create the same production faster. So let's talk about the importance of steam. James Watt developed the steam engine in the 1760s. And a loom, we've been talking a lot about textiles, a loom powered by steam could produce 7 times as much cloth as hand production. So you can see it was much more efficient. Steam engines were also great because they offered flexibility in location. They didn't have to be near water because they ran on coal or wood power instead of water. So you could really be located anywhere if you had a steam engine. The pattern of work changed at this time because the machines were doing all of the work, so you could hire younger, less skilled workers just to tend to those machines. And because of that, the employment of females and children resulted. There were no child labor laws at this time, so this became a major social change for society. Some very, very young children worked extremely long days. As you might imagine, changes in one industry lead to changes in another industry. So because steam power was growing in popularity, the iron industry grew. Steam power required that machines would be made of stronger metal to withstand that stronger power source, that extreme heat. So the iron industry grew. Wrought iron was most widely used until steel could be cheaply produced in the 1860s. And when steel did become so cheap to produce, it replaced iron very quickly as the metal of choice for these machines. It was stronger and just as durable. So as these machines start speeding up factory productions, methods of transportation also begin to improve because people are applying the knowledge that they have from the machinery for industry into other things like transportation. In 1830, the first railway line was built in England. It connected Manchester and Liverpool. And at this point, the age of railway started, building actually throughout much of the world. Shipping changed radically with the use of vessels without sails, and that allowed them to increase their tonnage capacity as well. This is an artist rendition of the railroad line from Nuremberg to Firth. The spectacle of the arrival and departure of the train attracts townspeople of all classes. Central Europe followed England and France in railroad mania. As I've already mentioned, industrialization changed the labor force because machinery was doing most of the work. They really only needed people to tend to the machines, so they hired women and children, people who hadn't normally been in the workforce. So we see this social structure begin to change. Previously, the social structure had pretty much been clergy, nobility, and commoners. Now we see this stronger middle class developing, the bourgeoisie. These are people of common birth who engaged in trade or other business ventures. The bourgeoisie included bankers, factory owners, merchants, shopkeepers, managers, lawyers, doctors. These people valued virtues of work and thrift ambition, and prudence, but often then perverted these into materialism, selfishness, callousness, and smugness. They struggled to end the aristocracy's political, economical, social discrimination against them. And by the end of the 19th century, bourgeois politicians shared authority with aristocrats. Sometimes I say aristocrats because of the movie. Anyway, so by the end of the 19th century, by the end of the 1800s, we have these middle-class politicians that are actually beginning to have the opportunity to share political authority with the aristocrats, which is a big deal. As society transforms from industrialization, we start to see differences, very distinct differences growing between middle and laboring classes. Factory workers are the newest, most rapidly growing social group. We still have artisans, these skilled craftspeople, that had been the largest group of workers in cities well into the 19th century. And we have servants numerous in capital cities. In terms of working life, factory workers usually were recent arrivals from agricultural areas, people who, because of industrialization, lost their farm jobs and moved to cities for work. The problem with this was that factory work was a dull routine. It also created many dangerous conditions because as these things developed, people are focused more on efficiency and fast production than they are so much safety. So, it's not until many accidents start happening that people start really focusing on safety. And because of the need for more metal, mines were growing in importance as well, and working in a mine is oppressive work. The conditions are usually very poor and very dangerous. The standard of living might be higher in the city than in the country, but the working and living conditions there were terrible. There were parliamentary reports and investigations that documented suffering. Keep in mind, many people are working, and if children are working and women are working, that means just about everyone in the family is working. So there's not really much quality of life going on at this time. Many reformers considered trade unions the only hope for workers, the opportunity for a trade union to make better conditions for these employees. The laissez-faire general public saw strikes as a tax on trade. Here's an image that depicts why city life could have been bad. So many people moved from rural areas into cities in order to find factory work, and that caused overcrowding. And about the center, kind of toward the right of your screen, you can see a smokestack that's smoke billowing out from steam engines in the distance. And you can see how these houses are just packed right on top of each other. So this image of London Row depicts the crowded and unsanitary conditions in industrial London. Workers and their families lived in row houses, each one just one room wide with a tiny yard in back. So people were losing kind of quality of life. And also, they're not really thinking about pollution at the time, but that's definitely one of the concerns. As conditions worsened in the cities of Great Britain, people started calling for change. Now, at this particular time in Britain, they had more freedom than most of the other European countries, but they really weren't a democratic society in the 19th century. They were dominated by landed aristocrats who controlled Parliament. The vast majority of other people couldn't vote. So basically what that's saying is, if you had land, then you were represented in Parliament. Otherwise, you just couldn't vote. And that created an issue. So some members of Parliament started urging reforms. In 1828, they repealed the 17th century law barring nonconformists from government and university positions. And Catholics gained the right to serve in Parliament. In 1833, slavery was abolished across the British Empire. And the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835 granted greater self-control to cities and towns. And finally, in 1848, a Public Health Act was passed that reformed sanitation. This image really shows a lot about the conditions in Europe during the time that we're talking about. As unemployed workers flooded into the cities throughout Europe in search of work, homelessness became a pressing social problem. So in order to address it, they created these facilities, not exactly a poorhouse, but sort of like kind of a prison-like facility building, just a large commissary or bunkhouse, if you will. And they had these coffins made for the living that were lined in order to give people a place to sleep and to keep them off the streets. These facilities were charitable institutions, and they reflected this common belief of the day that poverty was the fault of the poor. So we have industrialization developing throughout the world, really, but we're talking specifically about Europe here. And this idea that follows industrialization is that if you will work hard, you can be anything. You can become anything. Well, we have people who can't find jobs, and so they are viewed as lazy, that it's their fault that they're not wealthy. So we have this kind of change in attitude toward people, but we also have people trying to help them. I think one of the most misunderstood words that comes about from history is the word suffrage. S-U-F-F-R-A-G-E, suffrage. It's not suffrage. The words are two different things. So when we say suffrage, we tend to think of people suffering, right? Suffrage is different. Suffrage is the right to vote. So the Reform Bill of 1832 extended suffrage, the right to vote, into the middle class and made the House of Commons more representative. The high property qualifications for voting meant that workers did not vote. The Factory Act of 1833 actually limited the hours that kids could work. In the same year, children under 10 were banned from working in mines. It was a huge deal because children under 10 were the kids who could best fit into the close mining quarters. And because of that, children as young as 4 or 5 had been working in mines and in terrible situations. The Factory Act of 1847 limited the working hours for boys under 18 and women. Many workers resented prohibition of child labor since family incomes could be reduced if kids couldn't go to work. Now, I say this, and it's because we have a hard time seeing it this way. I mean, most of the times today, if we take a look at it, and we can't imagine sending our 5-year-old to work in a mine because we know that mines can collapse, it could kill them. All of the dirt in the mine is not good for breathing quality, that sort of thing. We can't imagine sending our children to work in a mine today. However, the approach to family life was so different during this time period and before it. So leading up to this time, we really don't have the idea, this notion of a family bond as such. People really started romanticizing love and family in the later part of the 1800s after the Industrial Revolution. So at this particular time, a kid was a mouth to feed, and if they could contribute to the family by earning their own keep, then that's what they did. The People's Charter of Demands was delivered to Parliament, calling for universal manhood suffrage, secret ballot, the end of property qualifications, was ignored by the government, but most of the other measures were actually eventually realized. So we do see some headway being made that would allow more people to vote. In the early 19th century, elementary education in Britain was managed by private people, church organizations, that sort of thing. The government did not promote it and they didn't finance it. In 1833, Parliament began to allocate some small amounts of money to provide elementary education. But by 1869, only half of school-aged children actually attended school. The Education Act of 1870 allowed local governments to establish elementary schools, and then by 1891, they allowed these schools to be free and attendance was required. Parliament passed the Combination Acts from 1799 to 1800 that made unions illegal, but in 1825 they allowed workers to unionize, but they forbid strikes from happening until 1875. Liberalism grew as a response to industrialization. Liberals argued that a free economy without government regulation was as important as political freedom to well-being of both the individual and the community. They also claimed that self-interest and competition spurred economic activity. Another idea proposed by liberalism was that the government must not block free competition or deprive individuals of property. Excuse me. They considered people responsible for their own misfortunes. So they were very often unmoved by the misery of the poor. They considered social reforms a dangerous meddling with the law of supply and demand. They followed Thomas Malthus's theory in Essay on the Principle of Population that supported laissez-faire economics and opposed state action to help the poor. Now, these things are not what we generally associate with liberalism today. Also, David Ricardo supported Malthus and said that wages tended to remain at the minimum needed to maintain workers. So, we're starting to see people concentrate on the well-being of the individual, but still not on helping the poor, because remember, these people believe that if you're poor or, have some other misfortune, it's your own fault because you're lazy, which is kind of this idea brought about by industrialization and the idea that if you work hard enough, you can be anything you want. Of course, we know that's not true. You have to have some other options and some things to help you, but at this particular point in history, that was the concept at the time. Utopian socialists argued that the liberal ideals protected the property of the wealthy and just left the others to die in poverty. Early socialism denounced the status quo for perpetuating injustice and held that people could create a better world. They sought to replace existing social order with a more just arrangement, but did not advocate class warfare. We have Saint Simon, who believed that his mission was to set society right, and that scientific knowledge could bind society and harness technology to better all of humanity. His vision of a scientifically organized society led by trained experts was a powerful force among intellectuals in the 19th century. There are two others I'd like to mention here too who brought in unique responses to industrialization. One was Charles Fourier. He argued that society conflicted with the natural needs of human, and that this tension was what was responsible for human misery. He sought to create phalansteries, these small communities, of about 1,600 people who would work tasks that interested them, and the money and the goods would be distributed equally. Think like communes that you might, have heard of from the 1960s. So a small group of people would live in a community, work together for the common good. In the 1840s in the United States, there were at least 29 such communities founded on these principles, but none of them really lasted. Also, Robert Owen was owner of New Lanark cotton mills in Scotland, and he resolved to improve lives of his employees. So to do that, he raised their wages, he upgraded their working conditions, and refused to hire children under 10, because remember, that was still a thing at that point. He provided homes for them. He gave them food and clothing at reasonable prices. He was convinced that environment was the principal shaper of character, and said that public education and factory reform would make better citizens of the poor. So you can see how some of those things actually came into play throughout the continuation of society after the Industrial Revolution. In conclusion, the Industrial Revolution, much like the French Revolution, helped modernize Europe, and it transformed every facet of society. Agricultural villages and handicraft manufacturing, like the putting out system that we've talked about in the past, were eclipsed in importance by cities and factories. Aristocratic power and values declined. The bourgeoisie increased in number, wealth, importance, and power. A person was increasingly judged by talent rather than birthright. Opportunities existed for upward mobility, and the Industrial Revolution was a great force for democratization. It hastened secularization of European life. The Industrial Revolution also made possible the highest standard of living in history, but also widened the gap between the West and the rest of the world in terms of science and technology.